An Israeli military inquiry into the Israel Defense Forces killing of 15 paramedics and aid workers in southern Gaza last month has found that there were several professional failures, breaches of orders and a failure to fully report the incident. But in its conclusion of its inquiry, the Israeli military said it found no evidence of execution. Well, this is the video from the incident. It was obtained from the mobile phone of one of the medics who was killed, and it was given to the New York Times newspaper. And that video being made public forced the Israeli army to admit that its initial account claiming that the vehicles approached without lights was in fact untrue. Well, the Israeli army's inquiry says troops did not use indiscriminate fire in the incident. It said a deputy commander will be dismissed from his position. Well, the Palestinian Red Crescent Society and others have been calling for an independent international investigation. Well, let's get the latest on that breaking news by going straight to Jerusalem and joining my colleague Gary O'Donoghue, who is there. Gary, just tell us more about what we know from the Israeli military in this internal investigation.
Well, I think we're seeing in this report that the Israeli army has come some distance from its initial description of what happened a week after the incident at the end of March. But even given that, it's still saying that this was, in a sense, an operational misunderstanding in terms of the deaths of the 14 medics and civil defence workers. In terms of the killing of the UN worker, they're saying that was a breach of orders, and they are dismissing, as you said, the deputy battalion commander from the Golani brigade there. So that is unusual for the Israeli army to actually dismiss someone, but that is a field commander on the ground. What else? In terms of further up the command chain, it's a reprimand for the brigade commander himself. I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions. Firstly, of course, people will say, look, these vehicles were approaching rapidly. There were lots of people jumping out of them. Well, that's kind of what happens with ambulances and fire trucks, right, when they get to an incident. And we already know, of course, that from earlier video evidence that these ambulances did have their lights on, did have their emergency signals on. And so this description of the commander not being able, because of night visibility or problems with visibility at night, to identify them, that raises questions. Also, I think they are now continuing to assert that 6 of those who died, 6 of the 14 ambulance workers and civil defence workers, were retrospectively, as they put it, identified as members of Hamas. Now, they have not produced any evidence for that. The names of all those ambulance workers and civil defence workers are in the public domain, so they could identify which ones they believe to be Hamas, and then people could go off and find out whether or not that was true or not. It's worth also pointing out, I think, that the IDF has already acknowledged that all of those who died were unarmed at this point in time. It does say, of course, and there has been evidence for this in the past, that Hamas has used medical vehicles to transport fighters at times. We know it's also used hospitals and schools at times to base some of its operations, some of its staff, some of its structures, if you like, its control structures. But I think this does really mark a bit of a low point for the Israeli army in terms of this incident, because this is one of the bloodiest involving the killing of medical workers specifically and rescue workers, if you like, during this whole war.
And Gary, I spoke to the Palestinian Red Crescent after this all happened, and they were adamant that they wanted an independent investigation. I'm assuming we don't yet have reaction from them, but I'm guessing that this is unlikely to satisfy those who were calling for an independent investigation.
I think that's certain to be the case. I think it's worth also pointing out, of course, that the PRCS, the Red Crescent Society, there were some initial assertions from them that these men may have been bound before they were killed. Now, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. The Israeli army is denying that, and the autopsies that were carried out by Hamas health officials, the forensic examiners on the ground, subsequent to that have not found any evidence of that. So that is one thing I think Israel is stressing, and certainly stresses very close to the top of the report, so the parts of the report we have seen. But you're right, of course, they will say, look, these men were unarmed, they were behaving like ambulances because they were ambulances, and you've not explained how this misidentification could take place. It's also worth saying, I think, the report is suggesting that this is a combat zone. Now, Gaza is a combat zone, clearly, but there are clear designations at times for specific areas. And from what I can see in this initial look through, the IDF does not seem to be claiming that this was specifically one of these red zones at the moment where you have to get permission to move around. Now, we'll check that, of course, but from what I can see initially, that's not being claimed by the IDF. So if that is true, if I'm right about that, then the ambulances and the civil defence people, were moving around in that sense legitimately, or without the kind of restrictions that Israel and the IDF imposes on them.
And Gary, we were showing on the screen a few seconds ago the video of the incident, which of course was pivotal really in terms of uncovering what exactly happened.
Yeah, this was a really distressing video, I think you'd have to say. It was found on the phone of a man called Rifat Radwan. He was one of those who died. He was in one of the second batch of ambulances that were sent out to find some of their colleagues who were by the side of the road in the first ambulance. And there's quite a lot of time where you hear him praying, you hear him aware, I think, that he's going to die. And of course, that is the video that emerged, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, perhaps, no, just 10 days ago now, which shows us that these ambulances did have their lights on, did have their emergency signals on, which, of course, the IDF had claimed they did not when they gave their first explanation of what had happened. And I think that video really forced the hand of the Israeli Defense Forces to come up with a much fuller explanation than they sometimes do in these circumstances. And I think that's why you're seeing some disciplinary action, a promise to learn some lessons, an expression of what they call regret for the harm for uninvolved civilians. I think some people will think that is somewhat of an understatement of what took place. But yeah, I don't think this is going to go away in any sense at this point in time, and the pressure will be kept up. Meanwhile, of course, civilians, dozens of civilians each day in Gaza are dying, and the humanitarian situation is getting much worse according to the various agencies that work there.